Two identical sisters vanished into the Appalachian wilderness in 1876, and they were never seen again. 7 years later, they returned, but no one recognized them. Their faces were the same, yet everything about them had changed. And what they carried back was something the mountains themselves could not have imagined. The wind stirred the trees, shaking loose dry leaves that danced across the forest floor. Shadows shifted between the trunks, elongated by the pale light of the late afternoon. The forest seemed alive, yet it offered no answers. Only silence, only absence. And for one small village tucked deep into the valleys of Appalachia, that silence was about to become permanent. The year was 1876. Appalachia stretched across ridges and valleys, a land of dense forests, rushing streams and mountains that rose like ancient guardians over the villages below. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, winding and treacherous, carved through the hills by generations of travelers, but always shifting under the rain and snow. Streams curved unpredictably, moss clung to every rock, and the wind carried voices that could never be fully understood, whispers of movement and life hidden within the dense trees. Villages here were small, tight-knit, and reliant upon each other. Homes were built of logs and stone, weathered by storms, fire, and decades of living. Families rose with the sun, tending to crops, animals, and chores that were often measured by the turning of the seasons. Children learned to read the land, noticing the slightest signs. The change in the clouds, the way the river altered its path after heavy rain, the subtle calls of birds that warned of approaching storms. Adults understood the rhythms of survival, when to harvest, when to hunt, when to travel, and when to remain at home. The mountains were constant and unyielding. They shaped the lives of those who lived within their shadow, demanding respect and attention. Paths could disappear overnight. Streams could flood or dry without warning. Every ridge, every hollow, and every bend in the river had meaning to those who watched carefully. And it was in one of these small, isolated valleys that two young sisters disappeared, leaving behind a village that would remember them for generations. When they returned 7 years later, their faces had not changed, but their presence, their essence, was entirely altered. Life in Appalachia was defined by isolation. Villages were scattered, separated by dense forests and rocky ridges that made travel difficult and sometimes dangerous. Roads were uncertain. A journey could take hours or days depending on weather and terrain. Snow lingered well into spring, and sudden storms could transform paths into mud rivers. The wind spoke through the trees, carrying voices of the past and shaping movement, often warning of change long before it arrived. The forest was as much a neighbor as the people themselves. Deer and bears moved silently among the trees. Birds called in patterns that sometimes seemed to answer one another. Insects droned incessantly through summer nights, forming a soft, continuous hum that wrapped the villages in a blanket of sound. Life demanded respect for these patterns. Villagers learned to observe, to predict, to anticipate. A footprint in the mud, a broken branch, a changed behavior of an animal could mean life or death. Every moment of attention was essential, and yet, even with this vigilance, the mountains could still hide what was to come. Within this landscape, people lived closely with one another. Families shared resources, neighbors exchanged help, and children learned skills from a young age, climbing, tracking, and listening to the subtle cues of nature. The mountains were steady, immutable, and ever-present, yet capable of swallowing lives in silence. And it was into this landscape of observation and risk that two young sisters would step, leaving the villagers with a question that would linger for 7 long years. The sisters were born 1 year apart, identical in appearance, yet distinct in personality. Their hair was brown like the bark of the forest trees, their eyes reflected the grey-blue of the mountain streams, and they moved with a rhythm that made them appear almost as one. One sister was deliberate, quiet, and observant. She noticed the shifts in the wind, the subtle patterns of the streams, the tracks left by animals. The other was lively, bold, and curious, wandering into every hollow, questioning everything, and testing boundaries that others would not dare cross. Together, they were inseparable. They laughed together, finished each other's sentences, and performed tasks with an unspoken coordination that awed everyone who watched them. The villagers spoke of them in hushed admiration. Children followed them, learning games, imitating gestures, watching as the twins explored the fields and forests with a combination of care and confidence. Adults commented on their closeness, noting how one's glance could convey what a sentence could not. Even strangers passing through the village remarked on the harmony between the two, their movements synchronized, their expressions mirroring one another. Their lives seemed ordinary on the surface, yet extraordinary in the way they moved through the village and the forest alike. And it was this ordinary rhythm that would soon be shattered. It began like any other morning. Mist lingered in the valleys, softening the edges of trees and fields. The sisters left their home with small baskets, stepping carefully over dew-soaked leaves, heading toward the forest path that ran along the outskirts of the village. Perhaps they planned to gather firewood or berries, or to collect water from the nearby stream. Their voices were light and cheerful, blending with the calls of birds and the murmuring flow of the river. A neighbor waved from his fence. The twins waved back, unaware that this day would mark the beginning of a story that would haunt the village for years. As hours passed, concern grew. Family members called their names, shouting into the trees, but the forest answered only with rustling leaves. Lanterns were lit, and dogs were brought to the forest's edge. Villagers moved cautiously among the trees, scanning every shadow, every footpath, every stone. But there was no sign, no footprints beyond the forest edge, no overturned rocks, no traces of movement except for the baskets left behind. By evening, panic had set in. The forest, ever indifferent, held its secrets tightly. The sisters were gone, swallowed by the mountains, and the village was left with an absence that no one could fill. Search parties formed immediately. Men, women, and children entered the forest, moving slowly, cautiously. Lanterns flickered among the trees. Dogs sniffed every path. Ears pricked for any sign. Streams were crossed, hills climbed, and fallen trees inspected. Every sound, a bird's cry, the snap of a branch, set hearts racing, but the twins remained elusive. Days passed, weeks passed. The villagers' desperation grew. The mountains offered no answers. Rumors circulated quietly. Paths that vanished overnight, hidden hollows that could swallow travelers, shadows that moved without explanation. Families grew weary, voices hoarse from calling names that went unanswered. Nights were restless, filled with imagined footsteps, imagined voices. Months passed. The twins were gone, leaving a weight that settled into every home, every field, every quiet moment. Life continued, but the rhythm had been broken. The forest remained indifferent, the mountains steady, and the villagers left with only questions. Questions that would echo through 7 years of silence. 7 years passed, slowly, like the turn of a winding river cutting through stone. The seasons cycled with the same regularity as always. Snow melted in early spring, streams swelled with the runoff, wildflowers bloomed, and the mountains carried their usual colors across the valleys. Yet for the villagers, time carried a weight that the mountains themselves could not bear. Every day reminded them of absence. The twin sisters, once the heart of the village, were gone. Their laughter, once a melody in every household, had been replaced with silence, a quiet that pressed against walls, seeped into the soil, and settled in the forests where they had last been seen. Children who had once played alongside the twins grew older, the memory of the girls fading into faint, sometimes incomplete recollections. Parents adapted to routines without the familiar presence, though the ache of absence lingered in small gestures. A chair left by the hearth, the empty space at the table during meals, the quiet moments when someone glanced at the edge of the forest, hoping to see a familiar figure emerge. Village elders spoke less often of the twins aloud, but their names were not forgotten. In whispered moments by firelight, parents would warn children not to wander too far, speaking of the twins as if their disappearance were both a tragedy and a cautionary tale. Rumors began to circulate, carried quietly through the valleys. Some said the girls had survived, learning the ways of the forest, living among creatures and forces unseen by ordinary eyes. Others suggested they had been taken in by travelers passing through, or perhaps by a hermit who dwelled deep in the hills. A few spoke of time itself bending within the woods, claiming that 7 years had passed differently for the sisters, that while the village endured one pace, the mountains had measured another entirely. No one knew which, if any, of these stories was true. And so the forest kept its secrets, leaving the village in a state of patient, anxious expectation. During this time, life moved forward despite the absence. Fields were plowed, animals tended, fires maintained, and meals prepared. The villagers continued their daily rituals, but there was always a sense of incompleteness, a quiet tension in the air. When the wind shifted through the trees in certain ways, or when a branch broke in the distance, villagers would pause, half expecting to see the familiar figures of the twins. This expectation shaped the rhythm of the village, a subtle undertone to every sound, every gesture, every glance toward the forest. Then, one evening, figures appeared at the edge of the village. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the valley, painting the fields in gold and amber. At first, no one believed what they were seeing. Could it truly be the twins? Their faces were the same, familiar in every detail, but their presence carried something unfamiliar, something almost intangible. Their movements were deliberate, almost careful, measured with a precision that the village had never observed before. Eyes that had once been bright and unrestrained now held a quiet awareness, scanning every detail as if the forest itself had imparted knowledge no ordinary human could possess. The twins stepped slowly onto the main path, baskets in hand, but their weight, their posture, and even the way the sunlight struck their hair made the villagers pause. Children instinctively stepped back, sensing a subtle difference. Adults exchanged glances, a mix of relief, confusion, and unease. A mother whispered a prayer. A father steadied himself against a fence post, uncertain whether to run forward or remain frozen. The twins moved toward the village slowly, acknowledging greetings with polite nods and brief smiles. They answered questions with care, their words measured, precise, often too considered for the casual conversation the villagers had once known. It was as if their voices, though familiar, were filtered through 7 years of unseen experience, their every syllable chosen deliberately. The first day of their return passed quietly. Villagers observed from doorways, through windows and along fences, noting the twins' every action. They carried out simple tasks, setting down baskets, helping with chores, speaking briefly with neighbors. Yet every gesture was careful, controlled, and subtly different. No child dared approach them uninvited. Even friends who had grown up with the sisters felt a subtle tension in their presence, an awareness that the twins had been shaped by something beyond the village, by a time and place that the mountains themselves had concealed. As days passed, subtle changes became more apparent. The twins' movements, while still fluid and precise, carried a deliberate restraint. One would pause mid-step, glancing toward the forest, as if expecting something, or nothing, to appear. Conversation was polite, but clipped, every gesture carefully measured. At night they rose quietly, moving through the village with a rhythm that suggested familiarity, with sounds imperceptible to others. Children began to whisper that the girls were different, that their laughter no longer carried the same warmth, that their eyes, though the same color, seemed to contain layers of knowledge that made others uncomfortable. The villagers noticed other oddities. The twins sometimes lingered by the streams, staring at the water in silence. They walked the hillsides alone, following paths that no one remembered them taking as children. One neighbor swore he saw them standing near the forest at dawn, observing the shadows and listening to the wind as though the mountains themselves were speaking to them. Even the simple act of carrying a basket or gathering firewood had a precision that was unsettling, as if the twins were measuring the world in a way no villager could comprehend. Stories began to spread quietly. The twins had been changed by the forest, the mountains, or some force that existed beyond ordinary understanding. Some claimed to hear them speaking softly to each other in a language that no one recognized. Others swore that when the twins looked at a person, it was as if they could see past flesh and bone, into thoughts, memories, and secrets. Fear mingled with curiosity. Reverence mingled with suspicion. The twins' return had solved the question of their disappearance, yet it had raised a dozen others. Speculation grew within the village and among nearby communities. Some said the girls had survived by learning the ways of the wild, mastering skills beyond ordinary understanding, living among the animals and the forest spirits. Others whispered that the twins had been taken in by a mysterious figure, a recluse who dwelled deep in the mountains, and that these years had shaped them profoundly. A few suggested something even stranger, that time in the forest did not move the same way as in the village, and that the twins' 7 years had been folded into a different pattern, measured by forces the villagers could not perceive. Elders began to pass the story along as legend, a tale meant to warn children of the mountain's power, of the forest's indifference, and of the fragility of human understanding. Parents spoke in hushed tones of the twins' endurance, and of how the forest might have changed them in ways invisible but profound. Travelers from neighboring valleys carried the story further, sometimes altering details, but the essence remained. The twins had vanished, and upon their return, the ordinary world they once knew had no longer been enough to contain them. The twins themselves spoke little of their time away. Their words were carefully chosen, their responses brief and measured. Villagers noted every syllable, searching for clues, but found none. Only the subtle signs remained: glances toward the forest, long silences, gestures that hinted at knowledge the village could not measure. Life continued, yet a quiet tension persisted. Every shadow, every sound, every movement carried the unspoken reminder that the twins had been changed, and that the mountains, forests, and years had been silent witnesses to something beyond comprehension. As the months continued, the village adjusted, yet unease lingered like a faint echo. Children no longer ran to greet the twins immediately. Adults hesitated before approaching, unsure if the girls before them were truly the same. The twins engaged with the village, helped with chores, and spoke in measured tones, yet an invisible distance separated them from those who had known them as children. Their return solved a mystery, but it did not heal the gap created by 7 years of absence. Every gesture carried weight. Every movement suggested layers of experience invisible to the village. Stories became layered, combining fact and legend, weaving a tapestry of memory, loss, and transformation. The twins' presence was a constant reminder that some things in the world, some experiences, could not be fully understood. And as the villagers adjusted to the strange normalcy of their return, the mountains remained indifferent, the forest remained silent, and the sisters carried within them the secrets of 7 years that no human eye had witnessed. In the months following their return, the twins' differences became impossible to ignore. At first, the villagers chalked it up to trauma, 7 years of living alone in the wilderness. But trauma would have faded with time. What remained was something else, something measured, precise, and undeniably altered. Their laughter, once carefree, now carried a careful cadence, almost as if each syllable had been tested before being spoken. Their movements were graceful, yet deliberate, each step, each gesture carefully considered. Neighbors reported that the twins often moved in sync with each other, but not in the innocent, natural way of children. There was an awareness, a calculation, in how they interacted with the environment. They would pause at the edges of shadows, tilt their heads in quiet observation, or linger near a stream for hours without speaking. Villagers noticed that when the twins were near, animals behaved differently. Birds quieted, dogs hesitated, even livestock seemed uneasy. It was as though the sisters had absorbed something from the forest, something invisible yet tangible, that allowed them to perceive the world in a way that the villagers could not. Life in the village continued, but everything had subtly changed. Paths through the forest were avoided more than before. Children were warned to never wander alone. Parents became hyper-aware of the smallest details. A broken twig, a sudden gust of wind, a shadow moving too fast. The twins' presence reminded everyone of the mountain's power and the uncertainty that lived just beyond the edges of the village. The villagers tried to maintain routines. Fields were plowed, crops harvested, animals tended, fires maintained. But the quiet tension in the air persisted. Every glance toward the forest carried a trace of fear. Every sudden sound sparked unease. Some villagers spoke openly of the twins' strangeness. Others avoided mention entirely, fearing that talking about it might draw unwanted attention, though no one could explain exactly what attention. Even routine interactions, trading goods, sharing meals, passing greetings, were shadowed by subtle awareness that the sisters had changed. The ordinary fabric of life had been altered in ways that could not be mended. For the twins, the village seemed both familiar and alien. The houses were unchanged, yet the energy had shifted. People they had once known intimately now carried a faint distance, subtle in gesture and gaze, but palpable to them. Conversations were carefully navigated. Questions were answered in measured tones. The twins began to move through the village in a quiet rhythm of observation, their eyes always scanning, their ears alert to sounds that seemed imperceptible to others. It was as if the 7 years of absence had heightened senses, sharpened instincts, and given them a perspective that the ordinary village could not comprehend. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the uncanny awareness the sisters seemed to possess. Some claimed that one of the twins would pause, glance at a person, and know a secret before a word was spoken. Others observed that the twins could anticipate events, predict when animals would move, when a storm would rise, even subtle human behaviors, without explanation. It was not malevolent. It was not hostile. It was simply different. And the villagers, who had once been their playmates and caretakers, were now witnesses to something that transcended ordinary understanding. Stories grew over time. Travelers passing through carried tales of the twins' return, of their precise, almost unnatural awareness, and of the forest that had seemingly shaped them. Some said that the girls had been taken by the mountains themselves, living among shadows and creatures that belonged neither to human nor natural worlds. Others believed the forest had taught them secrets, shaping their minds, sharpening their senses, and leaving the twins attuned to rhythms unseen. Even those closest to the sisters could not fully explain the changes, though they accepted them with a mixture of awe, caution, and curiosity. The twins did not speak of their time away. When asked directly, they would respond with a calm precision, never revealing the depth of experience the village could not understand. Villagers speculated endlessly. Did the forest teach them a different way to see, to move, to exist? Had time moved differently for them? Or had they survived some ordeal that humans could neither endure nor describe? The questions were endless, and answers were impossible. The twins became a living legend, a bridge between the ordinary world and something far older, stranger, and beyond comprehension. Years passed. The twins grew into young women, and their presence continued to shape the village. Children born after their disappearance were told stories of the sisters, taught cautionary lessons about the forest, and warned that some mysteries could not be unraveled. Adults who had witnessed their return carried a quiet tension for the rest of their lives. Daily life persisted, but a subtle awareness lingered that some forces in the mountains and forests were beyond measurement, and that humans were fragile in the face of such experiences. Even in ordinary acts, harvesting, cooking, tending animals, villagers carried reminders of what had occurred. A sudden gust of wind, the rustle of leaves, a shadow crossing a path. All became points of reflection. The twins' survival and return was celebrated, yet quietly feared. They were proof that endurance was possible, but that survival might come at a cost no one could measure or comprehend. The story of the twins became more than a tale of disappearance and return. It became a reflection on memory, time, and human resilience. 7 years in the forest had reshaped them, leaving marks visible and invisible. The villagers could not see the full extent of their experience, yet they felt its presence in subtle shifts of behavior, quiet glances, and movements that carried knowledge the mountains had imparted. It is said that the world around us shapes us in ways we rarely perceive. The mountains, the forests, and the passage of time are teachers, sculptors, and witnesses. The twins' story illustrates this truth with a clarity that leaves no room for simple explanation. It is not merely a tale of survival. It is a story of transformation, of endurance, and of the ways in which life outside ordinary understanding can leave permanent marks upon the human soul. The sisters had returned, But they were no longer entirely of the village. Part of them remained in the mountains, folded into the shadows, the wind, and the silence of the forest. Part of them belonged to the time they had lived apart, measured in ways the village could not follow. Generations later, the tale persisted, whispered among children and adults alike, a reminder that the world contains experiences beyond comprehension, and that some mysteries endure precisely because they cannot be resolved. Their return solved one question, yet left 100 others. Why did they survive? How had they changed? What had the mountains taught them? These questions remain unanswered, because some knowledge is beyond human reach. The forest, the streams, the mountains, they keep their secrets, revealing only what they choose, in ways humans may never understand. And so, the twins live both among the villagers and beyond, a reminder that the ordinary and the extraordinary exist side by side, and that some stories endure not because of closure, but because the mystery itself is the lesson. If this story fascinates you, subscribe for more tales from the Appalachian Mountains, where ordinary lives intersect with forces older than memory, and where every shadow might conceal a story waiting to be told. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, the mountains are patient, and their secrets are older than we can imagine.